Today is Thursday, and Thursday rhymes with overreaction. Okay, not really, but in some languages I'm pretty sure that those words are going to rhyme, and today we're going to make them rhyme because it's time to look at the very preliminary results of the performances of the specs in the raid after we have talked about this from a theory crafting and feelie crafting point of view. We were looking first at things like PTR results a few weeks ago on how each of the spec was doing in the PTR. Then we started moving on to something like simulations to try to figure out how the specs were going to perform. Now we have the first initial result. Now the first initial disclaimer to be had, of course, is that not only this is very volatile as it's just the first couple of days, not only this is just heroic, but also many of these results won't have, or almost all of them won't even have, the 4 pieces for the Amirdrassil tier set. And very few of them, a small amount of them will have the 2-piece set bonus. So we aren't even looking at this level of power increase. We aren't even looking at this level of power increase, which is done with a tier set, but more so, for example, of the power that the specs currently have with the 4-piece of Amirdrassil compared to the one that they would get in the next season, and whether it's relevant or not. For example, BM is supposed to be doing super well right now together with Assassination, but their Amirdrassil tier set, for example, for BM is just a 3.5% DPS gain. So even if they don't have this tier set in this set of results, it's not really gonna change that much. Of course, for other specs it might be drastically different. For example, Elemental Shaman not doing too well. Yeah, well, Elemental Shaman is about to become 14% stronger compared to these results because of the power of the tier set. So this is even more, of a temporary for fun type of analysis before we get to actually see the full power of these specs by the time they will complete their power increase, or in some unfortunate cases actually nerfing themselves once they complete their new tier set of this season. However, since the patch is new and there is plenty to talk about and to be curious about, it's gonna be interesting to go and take a look just how closely are the results respecting the supposed predictions on how the specs would be doing, for example, in the raid. We can then look at as well tomorrow, for example, at Mythic Plus, just to see how the first keys are shaping up in this season. Now, as you can see by yourself already, the first thing that you can see by yourself that pops out already is a couple of specs already ahead of the curve. Not literally, but, figuratively ahead of the curve. We have Beast Mastery Hunter and Assassination Rogue. Now, the tiniest of disclaimers is that BM Hunter is not that broken OP. They are still amongst the top results, still one of the best ones, but their pets were a tiny little bit on crack in these first couple of days, so quite a lot of their damage has been fixed back to being normal. This is not going to change their status of a top DPS spec, but just not nearly as far ahead as the rest, like we can see in this initial set of results in Heroic Amirdrassil. Now, let's help ourselves once more by looking at the actual sims, and Beast Mastery Hunter is doing quite well in single target, and Assassination Rogue is also a decently powerful spec, and both of them are performing quite well. If we can look at the opposite, and we can start laughing at who is at the bottom, for example, you have Marksmanship and a couple of the Warlock specs. Now, these two we kind of knew about already. Actually, these three. We have Marksmanship and we have the couple of Warlock specs not doing nearly as well, with Demonology as the only one that gets bailed out. And lo and behold, Demonology is also doing very well. However, Demo is doing much better than what their sims would suggest. Now, random inspection, is Demonology doing this much better than expected because they have been given, for example, Power Infusion, right? That would improve their performance, even though they are no longer nearly as powerful as last season with PI. Now, you can see from the top logs that actually it's not even that warranted, it's not even that guaranteed that many, at the very least, of demo warlocks are given power infusion nowadays. This was further proven by looking at the simulations when it came to how powerful PI was for demo in this season, which is at a pathetic 2.8%, which is beaten by, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different specs. So demo is actually doing quite well. It's not even thanks to PI, and it is reasonably outperforming their simulations. Now, can we see some other outliers in here? Well, the first one is the one that is missing in this entire list. You look at all of these specs and one is not here. One that is not here is augmentation. That's because augmentation is much harder to be able to sim, because of course you also need to be simming the performance of other specs that augmentation is buffing, so it gets much harder. However, we do know that augmentation, for example, was nerfed multiple times over and over, with the latest one being from just a few days ago, which was supposedly going to be a roughly a 10% or so damage nerf in the raid. So the result is at the moment that augmentation is doing terribly. What is also interesting, of course, is to compare it with the popularity. Because while, for example, marksmanship is doing terribly, and we are not even that surprised that marksmanship is not very powerful, however, we do have the confirmation. It's not that hunters are surprised at this. The best performing spec of hunter is also simultaneously the most popular, by almost 30% more than the second most popular. However, it's a difference when it comes to augmentation, because while augmentation is doing terribly, it is still a very popular spec. We can also compare it with Devastation, and Devastation, which is also doing reasonably well, slightly above what was expected of them from the sims, and yet Devastation is far less popular, for example, than augmentation. What we can say though is perhaps at the moment the biggest difference compared to these sims is probably Arms Warrior. Because Arms Warrior right now is doing quite well. You know, it's performing very well, especially when you compare it with what was expected of them, especially when you compare it with the expectation of Arms players themselves. Arms players were not too happy about the Ignore Pain changes coming into this patch. Not just the fact that Ignore Pain was changed with a significant nerf, but also with the fact that nothing in return, nothing as a compensation was given to Arms Warrior. So even the playstyle, even from a playstyle standpoint, Arms Warriors were not particularly happy at the beginning of this season, yet at the very least, for now, the spec is performing very well in Heroic. Maybe the bosses die faster, and somehow if the boss dies faster is better for them. Maybe the execute phases for some reason become more relevant with shorter bosses. Who knows? They are, though, performing quite better than expected of them. There is another spec, though, that pairs itself together with Arms compared to what was expected of them from simming, for example, which is Unholy. Because we talked about the bad performers like Marksmanship and like Destro and like Affliction, and we just vaulted over Unholy. That's because Unholy is also doing well. Now, unlike the question we had about Demo on whether or not they were going to be given power infusion, there are not that many questions about Unholy. As you can see from the performances, pretty much every single log but three, 4, maybe 5 logs out of all of the top logs of Unholy are being given power infusion. As we know, even after the nerfs to both power infusion and the burst of Unholy, which is putting this from 10 to 12% down to 6, even with 6 it is still the best target for power infusion. So at the very least from the early days of Heroic, it is showing up to be quite powerful. However, some of you with an IQ above 90 might be starting to wonder, wait a second, if all of these specs that were not expected to be at the top suddenly jumped at the top, if we were not expecting Assassination to be here, Arms to be here, Demo to be here, Unholy to be here, then where are the specs that were supposed to be here? First, we can start with the blue. The blue of both Elemental and Enhancement. because the blue was supposed to be here. The blue was supposed to be quite high up in the results when it came to single target simulations, for example, and now the blue is not doing nearly as well. These are just two of some of the top specs by looking at sims that are not actually showing up in the results. Another one that is not showing up in these results is Havoc Demon Hunter. Now, we have been talking about how OP Havoc Demon Hunter is, how overloaded it was made because of the rework, yet at the very least for now, when it comes to the performance in the raid, it's not nearly as good. However, those are for now though just the initial results with this amount of parses of popularity of each of the specs, which is bound to change greatly in the next few days as more and more players go through heroic, and then of course it will be completely forgotten by next week as more and more guilds start getting into mythic, and that will become more relevant, more important of a stat to look at when looking at the power of each spec. We have spent most of our time talking about the DPS, because that's always the more fun one. We can also though spend just some time talking about the healing. Now, the healing is also quite funny because we have talked also about the state of healers in the upcoming season, and Resto Shaman, for example, was one of the specs not very exciting in the upcoming season. We spent some time talking about Discipline for being very powerful in both the raid and Mythic Plus, Holy Paladin for being more powerful in Mythic Plus than in the raid, Preservation Evoker for being more powerful in the raid than in Mythic Plus, and Mischievous Monk for being more or less a slightly weaker version than Discipline, still strong in both the raid and Mythic Plus. Yet, most of this doesn't really matter in the first logs of this new season, with Resto Shaman doing apparently better than anyone else. You can also see this reflects what players think about the season by having Resto Shaman doing quite well, yet it's already dropping down in terms of popularity compared to other specs. Which is not too surprising, as there has not been too much hype about Restoration Shaman recently, not really being changed much in the patch either, so not many reasons for players to get into Resto Shaman right now. So it will be curious to see, perhaps sad for Shaman players to see how this will change as we get closer and closer to Mythic and starting to have more and more logs when it comes to Mythic. Now, there isn't much to look at when we are talking about tanks, of course. The best thing we can look at is the damage, which is kind of interesting, not that important in the raid, but still a curious stat, and also the popularity of the tanks already. Now, we know that in Mythic Plus, what seems to be the next meta, the next powerful tank is going to be Vengeance, yet as we mentioned already multiple times, it's likely not gonna have the same amount of dominance in the raid. As you can see here right now, we have quite the even spread of tanks right below what is by far the most popular right now, which is Blood. Definitely what is the most impressive change when talking about tanks is the fall off of Guardian. Guardian, who was significantly more popular last season, even in the raid. Guardian was a thing for being super meta in Mythic Plus, but that also brought the tank to be way more played in the raid. Nowadays, this gives you the picture of how much faith many of the tank players have on Guardian Druid being as powerful in this season. This would also give you the idea that many tanks believe that Blood Death Knight is going to be the top tank in this season, if we were just to look at the popularity. But this has more to do with Blood being generally a very popular tank regardless of its state in the meta, due to apparently how often tanks enjoy playing Blood more so than just being OP. We will see later on, deeper down Mythic, when it becomes more relevant and more important to see the pairing, the couple of tanks chosen by guilds. But for now, on these first couple of days across tanking as well as healing as well as DPSing, these are the results so far. In just a few hours, if not a few days, many of these bars will have gone up or down and swapped around because of how volatile all of this is. until we wait for next week at the very minimum to start seeing some more entries in Mythic, so that we can start looking at the performance of the specs boss by boss in Mythic raiding. But for now, what we had available for us to look at was Heroic. And after this initial sneak peek at how the specs are performing in the raid, we are now going to leave each other to the rest of our Thursday. We are, as usual, starting our goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I've been too busy playing the new patch, so last time I ate was 14 hours ago, and I just realized, yeah, my stomach is telling me